They didn't just burn my field, they planned it. 3 grown adults, pressed khakis, sun visors, arms crossed like they owned the whole county, stood at my fence line and watched 3 acres of winter wheat turn to roaring black smoke. My dog barked until her throat gave out. My little girl stood on the porch steps and cried. And Constance Belmore, HOA board president, $680,000 brick colonial 40 yards behind her, white Escalade still running in the driveway, looked straight through that fire at me and said,
"You should have just followed the rules, Harlan."
I looked at my field. Then I looked at those $1 million mansions behind her fence, nodded, smiled. Sure, Constance, every fire leaves a trail, and the wood in those mansions of hers burns real nice. I'm a patient man. Someone torched your entire livelihood, then called it community standards. What do? Tell me in the comments. And drop where you're watching from. I read every single one. Let me take you back about 3 years, to a Wednesday morning in late October, when my biggest problem was whether the seed drill needed a new hydraulic line before planting season. Life was quiet. Life was good. My name is Harlan Dowd, and I am not, by nature, a fighting man. I grew up about 40 miles east of where I live now, in a county where your neighbor's truck in your driveway at 6 a.m. meant they were there to help, not to sue you. My father ran a grain co-op for 30 years. My mother kept the books. I inherited their house, their work ethic, and, this becomes important later, their 41 acres of mixed-use agricultural land that had been in continuous farm operation since 1962. That last part, hold on to that. After my parents passed, I moved back from Raleigh, brought my daughter Wren, she was 9 then, and my Australian Shepherd Buckshot, and I started running the place as a small diversified farm. Winter wheat, some heritage tomatoes in summer, a half-acre of lavender my mother planted that I kept going mostly because it made Wren smile. The place smelled like soil and diesel in the morning, and something sweeter by afternoon, especially in July when the lavender hit full bloom. You'd step outside and the air had weight to it, warm, almost purple, thick with bees. It was not fancy, which is exactly the problem, according to Ridgecrest Estates. See, at some point between my childhood and my return, the county's eastern growth corridor exploded. What had been scrubby pasture land on 3 sides of my property got scraped flat, graded, and transformed into Ridgecrest Estates, a gated, deed-restricted community of 214 homes with a median value north of $620,000. Brick columns at the entrance, a pond with a fountain, a clubhouse that looked like someone had tried to build a Tuscan villa using a Waffle House budget. My 41 acres sat directly adjacent to their western perimeter. Their backyards butted up against my fence line, and while they'd bought houses next to a working farm, they had apparently not internalized what that meant. Enter Constance Belmore. Constance was the HOA board president, had been for 6 consecutive years, and ran Ridgecrest the way a Roman emperor might have run a small province, with absolute certainty that her authority was both legitimate and divinely ordained. She was maybe 55, drove a white Escalade with a personalized plate that read RIDGCST1, and had a way of tilting her chin up when she spoke to you that made you feel like she was always reading something disappointing written on your forehead. She knocked on my door 11 days after I harvested my first wheat crop. No hello, no introduction. She handed me a laminated notice, laminated, like she'd been planning this visit, and informed me that my exposed agricultural equipment, unkempt vegetation, and persistent odors were in violation of Ridgecrest Estates Community Aesthetics Code, and that I had 30 days to remediate or face a civil complaint. I stared at the notice. I stared at her. "Ma'am," I said, "I've got 41 acres of farmland that's been operating under an agricultural exemption since before your development was a twinkle in some developer's eye." She smiled. It did not reach her eyes. "Your exemption," she said, "doesn't apply to aesthetic nuisance under County Ordinance 44B. We've already spoken to the county commissioner." And she turned and walked back to her Escalade. The gravel crunched under her heels with a sound that somehow managed to be smug. I looked down at the laminated notice. I looked at my wheat field, gold and rustling and perfectly, stubbornly alive. And I thought, okay, so that's how this is going to go. I had no idea. The first 30 days, I treated Constance's notice the way I'd treat a wasp nest near the barn, with cautious respect and the hope that if I left it alone, it would leave me alone. I was wrong about that, too. I did my due diligence, called the county agricultural office, spoke to a woman named Dolores who'd been there 20 years, and laughed so hard at the phrase, aesthetic nuisance, that she had to put me on hold to compose herself. She confirmed what I suspected. My land carried a bona fide agricultural exemption under the state's Right to Farm Act. Ordinance 44B, she explained, applied to residential properties, not to active agricultural operations. Constance had either been misinformed or was gambling that I hadn't done my homework. I sent a certified letter back to the HOA, polite, factual, 2 paragraphs and a photocopy of my agricultural designation certificate. 2 weeks of silence. I almost relaxed. Then the county inspector showed up. He was a young guy, couldn't have been 30, with a clipboard and a slightly apologetic look, like someone had sent him on an errand he already knew was pointless. His name was Terry. He walked my property with me for 40 minutes, took some photos, scuffed his boot against the dirt in a way that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else, and finally said, "I don't see any violation here, Mr. Dowd. I'll note that in my report." "Appreciate it, Terry. Someone made a formal request for inspection," he said, not quite looking at me. "Board president from the development next door." "Yeah," I said. I figured. Terry drove away. I thought, strike one. Constance, apparently, thought differently, because 3 days later she arrived again, this time with 2 other board members in tow, a soft-spoken man named Gerald, who clearly wanted to be somewhere else, and a woman named Patrice, who took notes on a yellow legal pad with the focused intensity of someone documenting war crimes. They stood at my fence line and informed me they were filing a formal civil nuisance suit under the county's property relations statute, citing dust particulate from my fields, affecting air quality in adjacent residences. Dust particulate from a wheat field, in a county where half the roads are still unpaved. I will admit, that one surprised me. Not because it had merit, it absolutely did not, but because of the sheer commitment to absurdity it required. You have to really believe in your own authority to stand next to a man's fence with a legal pad and tell him his crops are polluting your neighborhood. The smell that day was diesel from my neighbor Ray Tuckerman's combine 2 fields over, and underneath it, the faint sweetness of my late lavender. Buckshot was sitting beside me with the patient dignity of a dog who has seen everything and judged nothing. Even he seemed skeptical. Now, here's where most people, and I understand this, I really do, would have gotten angry, would have raised their voice, would have said something regrettable in front of witnesses with legal pads. I did not do that. Instead, I called an attorney. Her name was Dolores Fitch, and she had been practicing agricultural and property law in this county for 31 years. Her office smelled like old coffee and case files, and she had the kind of calm that comes not from ease, but from having seen exactly this kind of nonsense approximately 400 times. She reviewed the nuisance filing in about 8 minutes, set it down, and said, "This is garbage, legally speaking. But it's expensive garbage to fight, and they know that." "How expensive?" "If they push it all the way, defending yourself could run you $15,000 to $20,000 in legal fees, even if you win every step." I sat with that for a moment. "What if I countersue?" Dolores smiled. "On what grounds?" "Harassment, malicious use of process." She tilted her head. "You'd need a pattern, more than 2 incidents." "Give them time," I said. She gave me a look that I'd later come to recognize as Dolores's version of, "You're not wrong, but I wish you were." She agreed to keep a running file on every HOA action going forward, documenting dates, notices, and communications. Cost me a small monthly retainer, but what it really bought me was a paper trail with a professional witness attached. Takeaway for anyone watching. Under most states' Right to Farm Acts, active agricultural operations are legally protected from nuisance lawsuits by adjacent residential developments, even ones built after the farm existed. Look up your state's specific version. It's a real shield. Meanwhile, Constance escalated again, because of course she did. She went to the County Planning Commission and formally requested a rezoning review of my land. Rezoning, from agricultural to residential, which, if successful, would void my exemption, expose me to full residential code enforcement, and, here's the beautiful irony she didn't think through yet, also massively increase my property tax assessment. She wanted to turn my farm into a liability, and she had just handed me the first piece of the puzzle I didn't know I was building. The rezoning request hit the county planning office on a Thursday. By Friday afternoon, I knew about it. Dolores from the agricultural office had apparently decided she liked me, or at least liked calling Constance's bluff, because she phoned me directly. "You'll want to respond to this," she said. "Public comment period is 60 days. Show up." I showed up. But first, I did something Constance had not anticipated. I talked to my neighbors. Not the Ridgecrest neighbors, though a few of them would matter later. I mean my actual neighbors, the people who had worked this land alongside my family for decades. Ray Tuckerman, who ran grain crops on 80 acres to my north, and had a memory like a steel trap and a handshake that could crack a walnut. Eleanor Marsh, who kept horses on 20 acres to my east, and had been fighting development pressure since the mid-90s. And old Clifton Briggs, who farmed hay and leased pasture on the county's western edge, and who showed up to county meetings in the same Carhartt jacket he'd worn for 15 years, never said more than 3 sentences, and somehow always made the commissioners nervous. These were not wealthy people. They were not politically connected in the way Constance understood political connection, but they were rooted, and in a rural county that means something. We met at Ray's kitchen table on a Saturday morning. The coffee was black and strong, and the windows were fogged with November cold. Outside, his fields lay fallow and brown, and the sky had the flat gray quality of a day that isn't going to give you anything for free. I laid out the situation. Ray listened. Eleanor nodded. Clifton looked at the table. "She wants your land rezoned," Ray said finally. "She wants my exemption gone. Because then she can complain about everything, and eventually make it too expensive to operate." Clifton looked up from the table. "There's 5 other farms in that county corridor," he said. "If yours goes residential, they'll come for ours next." He said it the way you state a law of physics, matter of fact, irrefutable. That was the moment I stopped thinking of this as my fight. We agreed to appear together at the Planning Commission hearing. Clifton knew a county commissioner personally, not through money or favors, but through 40 years of showing up to every public meeting without fail, which is its own kind of currency. Eleanor had documentation on every development incursion attempt in the Eastern Corridor, going back to 1998. And Ray, quiet, methodical Ray, had been quietly cross-referencing Ridgecrest's HOA deed restrictions with county records and had found something interesting. "Their deed covenants," he said, sliding a folder across the table, "have a clause. Section 12C states that the development was platted adjacent to, quote, existing agricultural operations, which are acknowledged as pre-existing and non-compatible land uses. Homeowners accepted that condition at purchase." I stared at him. "They literally signed a document," Ray said, "acknowledging your farm was there first and agreeing it was outside HOA jurisdiction. The smell of that coffee, the frost on the windows, I remember the exact texture of that moment, the feeling of a thing clicking into place. "Does Constance know about that clause?" I asked. Ray shrugged. "She knows. Question is whether she thinks you do." She did not think I did. And this is the thing about people who've run unchallenged for a long time. They stop checking their blind spots. Constance had filed 11 previous complaints against neighboring properties in 6 years, and not one of them had fought back with documentation. She had calibrated her aggression to a world where people either didn't know their rights or couldn't afford to defend them. I was about to introduce a new variable. At the Planning Commission hearing 6 weeks later, the room held about 40 people, commissioners at the front, Constance's contingent on one side in their pressed clothing, and on the other side, Ray, Eleanor, Clifton, 2 other farmers I hadn't even contacted. Word travels in a small county. Dolores Fitch with a binder 3 inches thick, and Wren, who was 11 now, and had decided to make a poster that read, "Farms Feed Families," in purple marker. I could see Constance register our side of the room. A flicker. Just a flicker. I presented our case. Dolores submitted the right to farm documentation, the deed covenant language, and a formal objection to the rezoning on the grounds of discriminatory targeting. Eleanor presented her historical record. Clifton said 4 sentences, all of which were devastating. The commission voted 4-1 to deny the rezoning request. Wren held her poster up for the full vote. Constance did not look at us when she left, but her jaw was tight enough to crack a back molar. Strike two. And people who lose strike two, in my experience, do not take a breath and reconsider their approach. They double down. They get reckless. They start making decisions from ego instead of strategy, which is how we got to the fire. Spring came, and my winter wheat came up clean and strong. 3 acres of it running along the western fence line, the exact stretch of field that backed up against Ridgecrest's rear yards. It was the most visible part of my operation from their side. Green first, then gold as the season turned, moving in the wind in a way that I found beautiful, and that Constance, I can only assume, found personally offensive. She sent 2 more notices in March. One citing excessive agricultural runoff. It had been a dry spring, there was no runoff. And one citing a county weed ordinance that did not, as Dolores confirmed in approximately 45 seconds, apply to cultivated crops. Both went into our file. Both were increasingly unhinged. Then, in late May, she took it further. She went door to door in Ridgecrest and collected signatures on a petition claiming my wheat field was harboring rodents that were invading their properties. She submitted the petition to the county health department and, simultaneously, to the local newspaper. The Messenger Gazette ran a small item. Residents petition for farm review. Nothing damaging, but enough to make my name show up in a search alongside words like health concern and resident complaint. Dolores called it reputational groundwork. She's softening the public perception of you before she makes her next move, she said. This is what you do when the legal angle isn't working. What is her next move? I don't know yet, but it'll be physical. When paperwork stops working, people shift to reality. Dolores was right. She is, in my experience, almost always right. On a Tuesday evening in June, a dry, still evening with the kind of heat that sits on your shoulders, I was inside with Ren working on a puzzle when Buckshot started barking. Not his stranger bark, or his coyote bark, his wrong bark. The low, sustained, this is not right bark that I'd learned to take seriously. I went to the back window. There were 2 men standing at my western fence line with a pump sprayer and a lit flare. I want to be careful here, because in that moment, I did not process what I was seeing instantly. The brain doesn't. It runs through alternatives. Maybe they're pest control. Maybe there's a permitted burn. Maybe I'm misreading the situation. It takes about 3 seconds to run through those alternatives and arrive at the only explanation that fits all the visual information. They were lighting my wheat field on fire. I called 911 before I ran outside. That instinct, call first, move second, was one of my father's rules, and I have never been more grateful for it than in that moment. I gave the dispatcher my address, said incendiary fire, possible arson, 2 individuals on my property, and was outside by the time she confirmed units were responding. The fire moved fast. Dry field, light wind from the east, and whoever had set it had made sure to start at multiple points. The smell was immediate and overwhelming. Hot green and then instantly black. The sharp chemical bite of burning grain, and underneath it something petroleum adjacent from whatever was in that sprayer. Buckshot was beside me, pressed against my leg, trembling. I did not try to fight the fire. I got Ren, got Buckshot, got my truck, and I got my phone recording. The 2 men were gone by the time the fire department arrived, but I had 11 seconds of video. Grainy, backlit, but showing 2 figures with equipment at my fence line and a visible ignition point. 3 acres of wheat, gone in under 20 minutes. The fire investigator who came the next morning, a quiet, thorough woman named Sandra, walked the burn pattern and told me within 30 minutes that it was consistent with intentional multi-point ignition. She collected soil samples from 3 locations where accelerant residue was visible. The samples went to the state lab. I filed an arson report. Dolores filed a civil complaint. And for the first time since this started, I felt something shift in my chest that wasn't dread. It was clarity. Because here's the thing about arson. It's no longer a neighbor dispute. It's not a planning commission fight. It's not a petition or a nuisance suit. It's a felony. And the moment Constance, and I had no proof yet, emphasis on yet, crossed from paperwork warfare into criminal territory, she changed the game entirely. She thought she was teaching me a lesson about power. She'd actually just handed me a weapon. The smell of that charred field stayed in my clothes for a week. Every morning I'd step outside and breathe it in. 3 acres of work, turned to soot. And I'd think, good, keep going. Because every step you take past the line makes the landing harder. The arson investigation moved at the pace investigations move, which is slower than you want when you're angry, and faster than you'd think when you consider what they were actually doing. But while Sandra and the sheriff's office worked their angle, Dolores and I worked ours. And that's when we found the thing that changed everything. Dolores had been doing what good property attorneys do, which is read documents that nobody else reads. She'd obtained the full Ridgecrest Estates HOA formation documents, the original articles, the financial records, the board minutes going back 6 years, through a public records request, because HOA financial records in our state are subject to disclosure to any property owner they affect. Mine was a bordering property. We qualified. She called me on a Thursday afternoon with a specific kind of quiet in her voice that I'd learned meant she'd found something good. "Harlan," she said, "are you sitting down?" "I'm standing in a burned field." "Sit down." What she'd found was this. Ridgecrest Estates HOA was, technically, insolvent. Over the preceding 4 years, Constance had been using HOA dues, collected from 214 households at $280 a month, partly for legitimate maintenance, and partly to fund a series of legal campaigns, consultant fees, and lobbying expenditures that had never been formally approved by the full board or disclosed in the annual financial statements sent to residents. The clubhouse renovation had gone $340,000 over budget. A landscape consulting contract paid $78,000 to a company that, on further examination, was registered to an address that turned out to be Constance's brother-in-law's house in Scottsdale. The HOA had approximately $14,000 in reserve. Their liability insurance had lapsed 4 months earlier due to a missed payment. Their liability insurance had lapsed, which meant that when the arson investigation connected Ridgecrest to the burning of my field, and the evidence was moving in that direction, because one of the men with the pump sprayer had been identified as a landscaping contractor regularly hired by the HOA, they would be facing civil liability with no insurance coverage, no reserve funds, and a board president whose financial management was about to become its own separate legal problem. Constance had been playing power games on an empty tank, and she'd had no idea that her next escalation, the fire, would be the thing that triggered a full financial audit. I sat down in the dirt in my burned field and felt something I hadn't felt in months. I felt calm. "How solid is this?" I asked Dolores. "The financial irregularities?" "Very solid. I've already sent a preliminary summary to the state HOA regulatory office and to the county DA's white-collar unit. And the arson connection? Still being built. But the landscaping contractor, fellow named Dustin Krebs, his invoices from the HOA go back 2 years. Sandra's team has him on a traffic camera 2 miles from your property the evening of the fire." I looked at the black field. The soil was still gray-dusted at the surface, but underneath, I knew it was fine. Burned fields recover. Sometimes they come back better, with the seed bank refreshed and the competition cleared. There's a term for it, cultural burning, used by farmers and land managers to reset a field. Constance had, entirely by accident, performed a useful agricultural practice on my land. I was going to make sure she understood the irony of that. But first, I needed a plan, a real one, not reactive, not defensive. It was time to build something. The week after Dolores's call, I did something that felt counterintuitive. I slowed down. Not in the legal track. That kept moving. Dolores kept filing. Sandra kept investigating. But personally, I stopped checking my phone every hour for updates. I stopped rehearsing arguments in my head at 2 a.m. I went back to the basics. I fixed the hydraulic line on the seed drill I'd been meaning to fix since October. I helped Ray repair a stretch of his east fence. I made Ren pancakes on Saturday morning and let Buckshot sleep on the couch, which I don't normally allow, but which felt right. And while I was doing those things, I was also, quietly, methodically, building the structure of what came next. The plan had 3 layers, and I want to walk through each one because every piece of it is something that exists in the real world and can be looked up and used by anyone in a similar situation. The first layer was the civil suit. Dolores filed a comprehensive civil complaint against the HOA, Constance Belmore personally, and Dustin Krebs's landscaping company. The complaint cited trespass, property destruction, arson, civil standard, malicious use of legal process for the prior nuisance suits, and tortious interference with agricultural operations. We requested damages that included the full market value of the destroyed crop, lost season revenue, cost of reseeding, legal fees going back 12 months, and, critically, punitive damages on the grounds of intentional and malicious conduct. The punitive damages request was the spine of the whole thing. Under our state's civil law, intentional destruction of agricultural property with documented prior harassment can support a punitive multiplier. That means if the base damages were $40,000, punitive could push the total to $120,000 or more. And with no HOA insurance and $14,000 in reserve, that number would fall directly on board members personally. Takeaway. In most states, HOA board members can be held personally liable for tortious acts when the HOA has insufficient funds, or when the acts fall outside the scope of legitimate board authority. This is called piercing the corporate veil, and it's worth understanding if you're in an HOA dispute. The second layer was the regulatory track. The financial irregularities Dolores had found weren't just a civil matter, they were potentially criminal. Misappropriation of HOA funds, undisclosed related party transactions, fraudulent financial reporting to residents. We submitted a formal complaint to the state's HOA Regulatory Division, which exists in most states and is wildly underutilized, and simultaneously submitted documentation to the county DA's office and, on Ray's suggestion, to the State Attorney General's Consumer Protection Division. We also sent a copy of the financial audit summary to every single homeowner in Ridgecrest. That last one was legal because HOA financial records were subject to disclosure. We weren't leaking private information. We were just making sure 214 households knew what had been done with their $280 a month. Takeaway. HOA residents have the right to inspect financial records in most states. If you suspect mismanagement, submit a formal written records request to the board. They are typically required to respond within 30 days. The third layer was the one that required the most patience and the least paperwork. I'm going to call it the fire lane problem, and I'll explain. The rear yards of the Ridgecrest properties backing up to my fence line had, at some point during construction, been graded in a way that directed stormwater runoff onto my land. Not dramatically, a 2% slope, barely visible, but enough that over time my western fence line had accumulated drainage. I had documented this for 2 years with photos and soil moisture readings, mostly out of habit. A drainage trespass claim, water being intentionally or negligently directed onto adjacent property, is a legitimate civil cause of action. It's a slow burn claim, not a dramatic one, but when combined with everything else, it added to the pattern. More than that, it meant that when the county engineer came to inspect the arson damage, and I happened to mention the drainage situation, she also happened to walk the grading with a level, and she found something more interesting than a 2% slope. She found that the HOA's drainage infrastructure, the whole system serving those rear yards, had been installed without the required county easement approval. The permits were missing. The as-built drawings didn't match the actual installation, which meant every home in the western tier of Ridgecrest was technically in violation of county drainage code. I didn't do anything with that immediately. I just let it sit in the file, a card I hadn't played yet. I had been in this fight for nearly 2 years now, and I had learned one thing above all others. Timing is everything. You don't play your cards when you're angry. You play them when they'll land with maximum effect. Eleanor had been organizing. Ray had been talking to people. And Clifton, quiet, immovable Clifton, had made a phone call to a journalist he knew at the regional paper who covered municipal accountability. The stage was almost set. Constance knew something was coming. She may not have known exactly what, but people with her instincts for power can smell a shift, and something had shifted. She went on offense. Her first move was to approach 2 of the 4 commissioners who had voted against the rezoning request and suggest, through intermediaries, carefully, deniably, that there might be community support for their re-election campaigns if certain matters could be revisited. This was, in the generous interpretation, civic engagement. In the less generous interpretation, it was attempted quid pro quo with local officials. One of the commissioners, to his credit, called Dolores directly and told her about the conversation. He was angry. He'd been a commissioner for 8 years and had never been approached like that. He documented it in writing and submitted a formal disclosure to the county ethics board. Strike 3. Constance's second move was uglier. She went after Wren. Not directly, she was smarter than direct. But she contacted the parent board of the elementary school's PTA, of which Constance happened to be a member, naturally, and began circulating a story that I had been hostile and threatening to HOA residents, and that the school might want to consider whether Wren's home situation was stable. The implication, dressed in careful language, was that a child living on a contested property with a father under legal scrutiny might need monitoring. I found out about this from another parent who was disgusted by it and called me immediately. I want to be honest, that one got to me. The wheat field, fine. The legal fees, manageable. But using my daughter as a pressure point, that broke something loose in me that I had to work hard to put back under control. I called Dolores at 8 p.m. "Don't react," she said, before I'd finished explaining. "She went after Wren." "I know, and that's going into the complaint as defamation and intentional infliction of emotional distress, which under our state statute carries its own damages. But you cannot react publicly right now. You are 6 weeks from a criminal referral hearing and 3 weeks from the civil deposition. If you blow up now, she gets to reframe the story." I stood in my kitchen for a long time after that call. The kitchen that smelled like the soup I'd made for dinner, and outside the window, the dark shape of the burned field under a half moon. Jackshot had his chin on my foot. I breathed. I did not react publicly. Instead, I wrote a letter, private, not sent, in which I said everything I wanted to say. Then I folded it and put it in the drawer. Then I went and checked on Wren, who was asleep, who knew nothing about any of this, who had her purple marker poster from the Planning Commission hearing pinned above her bed where other kids had posters of pop stars. She'd added to it, in smaller letters underneath, "Farms feed families," she'd written, "and our farm is staying." I took a photo of that. I kept it on my phone. I looked at it whenever Constance's noise got too loud. Meanwhile, Dustin Krebs, the landscaping contractor Sandra had identified near my property the night of the fire, had been brought in for questioning. He had, through his attorney, begun exploring cooperation with the DA's office. This is what happens when a contractor who charges $400 an hour for hedge trimming is told he's facing felony arson charges. He starts doing math very quickly. The math, in Dustin's case, led him to a signed work order. A written instruction on HOA letterhead, initialed by Constance, authorizing vegetation clearance, western perimeter, urgent, for the evening in question. The work order didn't say arson. Constance hadn't written "burn the wheat field" in so many words. But a work order authorizing clearance activity on a night when an arson occurred, combined with a traffic camera, combined with accelerant residue matching the compound in Dustin's professional sprayer inventory, that was a chain of evidence that didn't leave a lot of room for interpretation. The DA's office opened a formal criminal investigation. Constance hired a private attorney. Her name started appearing in county court records for the first time. Ridgecrest residents were getting restless. The financial summary we'd circulated had done its work. At a board meeting I wasn't present at, 3 homeowners stood up and demanded an independent audit. Constance called the meeting to order, gavelled past their objections, and adjourned inside 12 minutes. She was running, just not fast enough. With the criminal track now open and the civil suit proceeding, Constance had one move left: make me look like the problem. She hired a PR firm. I'm not joking, a small one, but a PR firm, paid out of her personal funds because the HOAs were forensically frozen pending audit. They produced a 2-page document distributed to local media framing me as an aggressive landowner attempting to exploit legal technicalities to threaten a peaceful residential community. It named me by name. It included a photo of my equipment, a grain auger, that had been cropped to look, I suppose, more industrial and sinister than a grain auger actually looks. The Messenger Gazette ran a brief item. The regional paper, where Clifton's journalist contact worked, did not run it. She'd already been building her own piece. Then Constance did something that I believe was born entirely of panic. She filed a complaint with the State Agricultural Board, claiming I had been operating unsafe equipment that posed a hazard to adjacent properties, specifically citing the auger. The State AG Board sent a routine inquiry. I responded with documentation of every maintenance record going back 3 years, a signed inspection certificate from my equipment dealer, and a letter from Ray Tuckerman, Eleanor Marsh, and Clifton Briggs attesting to my operational practices. The State Ag Board closed the complaint in 8 days. Form letter, no violation found. What Constance didn't know, couldn't know, because she'd never bothered to actually learn anything about the people she was fighting, was that Clifton had a relationship with the regional editor that went back 15 years. Not a favor relationship, not a back-scratching relationship, an integrity relationship, the kind you build by being consistently factual and credible over a long period of time. The journalist, whose name was Patrice Welliver, different Patrice from the legal pad Patrice on the HOA board, I know, had been quietly working her story for 3 months. She had our financial documents. She had the Planning Commission record. She had the arson investigation timeline. She had interviews with 4 Ridgecrest homeowners who had gone off record, then on record, because the circulation of the financial summary had broken something loose in the community. She also had a detail I didn't know about until her story was nearly done. 2 years before any of this started, Constance had attempted a similar campaign against a different adjacent property owner, an elderly man named Vester, who ran a small plant nursery. She had filed nuisance suits, drainage complaints, and code violations. Vester, who was 76 and couldn't afford to fight, had sold his property at a significant loss to a development company that, you can see this coming, was quietly connected to the same Scottsdale registered consulting firm that had received $78,000 from the HOA budget. Constance wasn't just abusing authority, she was using it as an instrument of land acquisition. Patrice Welliver was going to publish on a Thursday. I knew the date. I'd been asked for comment, provided a full statement, and agreed to a photo of Wren and me, standing in the reseeded western field. New green shoots visible, 3 weeks after planting. The field Constance had burned was coming back. But the Thursday story was the second thing that happened that week. The first thing happened Tuesday. Dustin Krebs's cooperation with the DA became formal. He signed a statement. He corroborated the work order. He identified Constance as the person who had given him verbal instructions that he had interpreted and documented in a personal note as, "Make sure that field doesn't come back this season." The DA issued a criminal summons for Constance Belmore on charges of arson in the 3rd degree, criminal conspiracy, and malicious destruction of agricultural property. She was served at her home at 7 a.m. on a Tuesday. I heard about it from Dolores at 7:45. "It's real," Dolores said. "Yeah," I said. I was standing in the reseeded field. The morning was cool, and the new wheat shoots were up maybe 2 inches, catching the early light, that pale, almost yellow-green of very young grain. The air smelled like soil, and something fresh that doesn't have a name but that farmers know, the smell of ground that's decided to start again. I stood there for a long time. I wasn't gloating. Gloating felt wrong for what this moment actually was. What I felt was closer to exhaustion and relief, and something quieter underneath both of those. Like watching a very long, very loud storm finally move off the horizon. It wasn't over yet. The climax was still coming. But the ground had shifted, and what was growing in it was mine. 2 days after the criminal summons, Ridgecrest held an emergency HOA meeting. They had to. State law required it, with board leadership under criminal investigation and financial records frozen by a regulatory audit. The HOA was legally obligated to convene a full membership meeting to address governance. They couldn't avoid it. Every homeowner had been formally notified. I was not a member of the HOA, but the meeting was held at the County Community Center, a public facility, and was therefore open to observers. Dolores confirmed this. She also confirmed that Sandra, the fire investigator, would be present at the front of the room as a courtesy to the membership, there to answer factual questions about the arson investigation, and that Patrice Welliver from the paper would be there, recorder on the table. Ray drove. Eleanor came. Clifton came in his Carhartt jacket. Dolores wore the closest thing to battle armor that a property attorney wears, a charcoal blazer and a 3-inch binder. We arrived 10 minutes early and sat in the second row. The room held maybe 180 people by the time the meeting came to order, and the air was the specific quality of air that accumulates when a lot of people who are angry are also trying to remain civil. The overhead fluorescents buzzed. Someone's toddler was asleep across 2 chairs in the back. The smell of bad coffee from a folding table carafe saturated the whole left side of the room. Constance was there. I'll give her this. She showed up. She sat at the board table in a cream blazer, spine straight, chin at its customary altitude. Her attorney was beside her. Gerald and Patrice with the legal pad were also there, both radiating the energy of people who have realized they are in a photograph they will deeply regret. The meeting opened with the HOA's interim manager, appointed by the regulatory board, not elected, reading a summary of the financial audit findings, aloud, into a microphone. $78,000 to the Scottsdale Company, $340,000 in undisclosed renovation overruns, $22,000 in legal fees incurred for HOA actions that had never been formally authorized by the board, lapsed insurance. The room was very quiet during this reading. Then Sandra presented, briefly and factually, the status of the arson investigation. She said what was provable: ignition points, accelerant, contractor identification, work order. She did not editorialize. She didn't need to. Then the floor opened for homeowner comments. The first person to the microphone was a woman I didn't know, mid-40s, working mom energy, the kind of tired that comes from being lied to by someone you trusted. She said she had paid HOA dues for 4 years, and she wanted to know, specifically, how board decisions to pursue legal action against a neighboring farmer had been authorized without member vote, when the bylaws required member vote for expenditures over $10,000. Constance's attorney whispered in her ear. Constance said, "Those actions were taken under emergency authority provisions." "What emergency?" the woman asked. Silence. A man in the back stood up without waiting to be called. "My backyard drainage has been wrong since we moved in," he said. "We keep reporting it to the board. We were told it was our problem. Now I'm hearing the drainage infrastructure wasn't even permitted right?" Murmur through the room. Another homeowner. "How are we covered for liability if the insurance lapsed?" Constance. "The insurance matter is being addressed. It's been lapsed 4 months. Is being addressed by the interim management team. You're under criminal investigation." This from a man near the front, flat and factual, the way you state a thing that everyone knows and no one has said aloud yet. "You're under criminal investigation. How are you still sitting at that table?" Constance's attorney touched her arm. And then Dolores stood up. She didn't go to the microphone. She just stood, and the room went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when someone with genuine authority, not claimed authority, earned authority, decides to speak. "My name is Dolores Fitch," she said. "I represent Harlan Dowd, the owner of the adjacent agricultural property whose crops were destroyed by arson earlier this year. I want to address 3 specific legal matters for the benefit of homeowners present." She addressed them, clearly, carefully, 1 sentence at a time. She explained personal liability for board members when HOA acts fall outside authorized scope. She explained the civil suit and its potential impact on individual homeowner property values due to judgment liens. She explained that homeowners had 30 days to formally request independent legal representation from the HOA's obligation to defend them. Every sentence landed like a stone in still water. Constance looked, for the first time since I'd known her, genuinely small. Then Dolores said, "My client has no interest in making this community suffer. The homeowners here did nothing wrong. His interest is in accountability for specific individuals and in making sure what happened to his farm and to Mr. Vester before him does not happen to anyone else." She sat down. The room breathed. Constance looked at her attorney. Her attorney looked at the table. Gerald appeared to be calculating whether he could become invisible. Later, 2 weeks later, in a motion that her own attorney recommended, Constance Belmore resigned from the HOA board. The civil suit moved towards settlement. The criminal case proceeded separately and was not ours to negotiate. The fire had come home. The civil settlement came through in October, 14 months after the fire, almost exactly 2 years after Constance had first handed me that laminated notice at my front door. The terms were confidential in specifics, but I'll tell you this: the reseeded field is now 5 acres instead of 3. I bought the additional 2 acres from a land parcel that became available when Ridgecrest's western tier drainage issue required remediation work that, in turn, required easement negotiations, which, in turn, opened a chain of property discussions that ended with me acquiring the buffer strip I'd needed for years, at a price that was very fair. The lavender my mother planted came back stronger that year. I don't know if that's soil chemistry or something else, but I prefer not to examine it too carefully. Some things you just accept. Wren was 12 by the time it was over, and understood more of what had happened than I'd wanted her to. She asked me once, near the end, whether I was angry at Constance. I thought about it honestly. I was, I said. For a while I was very angry, but mostly I was just trying to protect something worth protecting. The farm? The farm. You. The idea that the rules are supposed to work for people, not against them. She thought about that. Then she said, "Can I have a horse?" The answer was still no, but the fact that she could ask it felt like health. What happened to Constance? The criminal case resulted in a plea agreement. Arson charges reduced in exchange for restitution, community service, and a permanent prohibition from serving on any HOA board in the state. She sold her Ridgecrest home the following spring. The white Escalade is presumably somewhere else now. The RIDGCST1 plate retired. The HOA itself reconstituted under new leadership. A retired civil engineer named Boyd, who immediately hired an independent auditor and restructured the dues structure. He called me once, early in his tenure, and asked if there was anything the community could do to start clean. I suggested two things. The first was a formal acknowledgement, in writing, distributed to all homeowners, of the agricultural covenant in their deed language. Not an apology, just a clear statement of what the documents had always said. My farm was here first, my operation is protected, and that's part of what they bought. Boyd agreed. The second was something Eleanor Marsh had proposed months earlier, a small land conservation initiative. There were 3 parcels in our county corridor, my land, Ray's, and a third owned by a family who'd been fielding developer offers for 2 years, that together formed a continuous agricultural corridor. If we could secure a voluntary agricultural conservation easement on all 3, the land would be protected from development pressure in perpetuity, while remaining fully operational for farming. The new Ridgecrest board came in as a co-sponsor of the easement filing, not because they owed us, they didn't, but because several homeowners, post-settlement, had come to understand that living next to working farmland had value, food value, environmental value, the kind of value that doesn't show up on a comparable sales report, but shows up every June when the lavender blooms and the air has that weight to it. The easement was filed the following February. 22 acres of active farmland permanently protected. Ray and I split the cost of a small educational sign at the field entrance that identifies the corridor and explains what a conservation easement is. It gets looked at more than you'd think. I also started a small annual scholarship, the Dowd Agricultural Continuation Award, for county high school students pursuing agricultural degrees or vocational programs. Not large, $500 a year, but it exists. And here's the last thing I'll tell you. Last spring, Wren helped me plant the new 5-acre field. She drove the seed drill for 2 passes and only ran slightly offline once. Buckshot supervised from the fence post, because he's 7 now and has opinions about field work. The sky was that particular blue of an April morning in the Mid-South, the kind where the light comes in at an angle, and the whole world looks